Calder Rourke only wanted to cross the tarmac, run his hands over the hull of an aging transport plane, and get 40 wounded veterans home before the storm sealed off the sky for good. But in the eyes of Vivian Whitlock Hawthorne, the woman who ran the company that owned every inch of that runway, he was nothing more than a scruffy single father in a faded flight jacket blocking the path of a multi-million-dollar aircraft. She snapped her fingers at security without asking his name. A loadmaster shoved him off the ramp in front of watching cameras. Then the cabin door opened and 40 injured passengers went silent all at once. One of them, an old medic leaning on a cane, said the only words that mattered: "Without Rourke, nobody flies." Dawn came up gray and heavy over Fort Holden Airfield, a once military strip that Hawthorne Aerodyne had folded into its commercial fleet 2 years earlier. The air already smelt like the storm system pressing in from the coast. Vivian arrived in a line of black sedans, dressed like she was walking into a boardroom rather than a hangar, because in her mind she was. The company's board had been circling for months whispering about maintenance shortcuts and missed inspections. Today's medical evacuation flight was supposed to be proof that Hawthorne Aerodyne still had the discipline to handle government contracts. She needed the flight crew sharp, the aircraft flawless, and every camera on the runway to see competence rather than chaos. Calder Rourke showed up without any of the polish the moment seemed to demand. He wore a jacket that had clearly survived more winters than most of the staff around him, carrying a single canvas bag of personal tools. Nothing about him signaled importance to the men stationed at the gate, and certainly nothing about him matched the picture in Brooks Vale's head of who belonged near a chartered evacuation flight. Brooks, the lead loadmaster and a man who enjoyed the small authority his clipboard gave him, mistook Cal for a mechanic's assistant or worse, some relative of a patient who had wandered too close to the aircraft. He ordered Cal off the ramp before Cal had said more than a few words. Cal didn't argue. He simply explained, in a voice too calm for the tension building around him, that he needed to inspect the aircraft before it left the ground. That composure irritated Brooks more than shouting would have because it didn't fit the script Brooks wanted to perform in front of his new corporate boss. Vivian caught the exchange from across the tarmac and made her judgment in under 3 seconds, the way she judged most things that threatened her control of a situation. She didn't ask his name. She didn't check a manifest. She simply said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Get him away from my aircraft." That was the first insult, delivered without a second thought, and it landed on a man standing in front of a plane he had flown more than 1,000 hours himself. A few of the ground crew exchanged uneasy glances as security closed in around him, sensing something didn't quite fit the scene even if they couldn't name it. Cal simply stepped back, tucked his hands into his jacket pockets, and watched the aircraft from behind the fence line, the way a man watches a house he used to live in. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for identification to prove a point nobody had asked him to prove. There was a stillness to him that read, to anyone paying closer attention, less like defeat and more like patience being spent on people who hadn't yet earned it. Vivian didn't look back at him twice, already moving on to the next item on her schedule, certain the matter was settled. Vivian walked into the operations building with the kind of posture that made junior staff straighten their own spines out of instinct because composure was the only armor she had left this quarter. Hawthorne Aerodyne had spent the last several months under a quiet siege from its own board, suspicion mounting that maintenance budgets had been trimmed too far in the name of protecting margins. Several military contracts hung in the balance, and this evacuation run was being treated internally as a referendum on whether the company still deserved them. If the flight went smoothly, Vivian kept her seat. If it faltered in any visible way, she would hand her enemies exactly what they needed. Augustus Blackstone called from New York before the coffee in the operations room had even cooled, his voice arriving through the screen with the particular chill of a man who enjoyed reminding people of their fragility. He told Vivian plainly that if today's flight failed, the board would treat it as final confirmation that she couldn't run the company her own family built. Everett Kane, the company's chief operating officer, stood just behind her chair offering reassurance that sounded almost rehearsed, insisting the replacement crew was fully briefed and the aircraft had cleared every required check. He said the word ready 3 times in under a minute, which Vivian noticed but did not yet question. What Vivian did not know was that Everett had quietly buried a technical flag on the very aircraft scheduled for departure, an aging Ha-77 Atlas that formed the backbone of Hawthorne's medical transport line. This flight wasn't simply another evacuation run. It was the government's last live test of whether Hawthorne Aerodyne's fleet still met the standards required to keep flying wounded service members home. Every eye that mattered, uniformed and civilian alike, would be watching how this single aircraft performed under real weather and real weight. Vivian had inherited the company from her father, Sterling Whitlock, a man who built his reputation on an old-fashioned certainty that appearances mattered as much as substance. She had spent years trying to prove she deserved the name stitched into the company's letterhead. Sterling rarely called anymore, his health having thinned along with his patience for the daily grind of running an airline, but his presence still hovered over every decision she made, a silent judge she could never fully satisfy no matter how well the quarterly numbers looked. She had learned to read a room the way her father once had, quickly and without sentiment, sorting people into categories of useful and irrelevant within seconds of meeting them. It was a skill that had served her well in boardrooms full of men waiting for her to fail. But it was a skill that on this particular morning would cost her far more than she yet understood. Outside the security fence, Cal stood with his eyes fixed on the Atlas, arms crossed, expression unreadable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. He caught a faint wrong pitch coming off the auxiliary hydraulic pump, a sound buried so deep in mechanical noise that most technicians would have missed it entirely. It was the kind of sound only a man who had survived a failure on this exact aircraft line would recognize instantly, the kind that lived in memory long after it left the ears. Before the gate confrontation, Cal had made a short call to his daughter, Tessa, reminding her to eat breakfast and promising he'd be home once the flight crew he was helping finish their run. The call was brief and unremarkable on its surface, but it revealed the quiet architecture of his life since his wife's death, a single father trying to keep one small household steady while the rest of the world kept asking more of him. He wasn't chasing recognition, and he wasn't chasing danger. He was trying in his own worn-down way to stay ordinary. A short memory surfaced as he watched the Atlas being fueled, one he rarely allowed himself to sit inside for long. Years earlier, Cal had flown medical evacuation missions for the Navy, pulling wounded personnel out of conditions most pilots would refuse to fly through. He survived the missions that broke other men, but he lost the person who mattered most to him during an investigation into an aircraft failure. His wife, Nora Ellison Rourke, an aviation engineer who had spent her final months trying to warn a company that a design flaw in their hydraulic reporting system would eventually kill someone. After she died, Cal walked away from active flying and took quiet part-time consulting work, choosing invisibility over another cockpit seat. He hadn't come to Fort Halton today as a Hawthorne employee. A handful of former military medics who trusted him personally had specifically requested his presence, believing he was the only pilot capable of navigating the coming storm system without risk to the passengers on board. Yet somehow in the paperwork that determined who was allowed near the aircraft, his name had quietly vanished from the approved access list, as though someone hadn't wanted him anywhere close to this particular flight. The years between the accident that ended his active service and this gray morning on the tarmac had not been kind in any dramatic way, only in the slow grinding way that grief tends to be. Cal had taken small consulting jobs inspecting private aircraft for wealthy owners who wanted a second opinion before a purchase. Work that paid enough to keep the house and asked nothing of the part of him that still woke at night replaying radio static from a storm off the Alaskan coast. He raised Tessa mostly alone, learning the rhythms of school pickups and grocery lists the same methodical way he had once learned instrument panels one checklist at a time. Friends from his old unit called occasionally, usually to ask if he'd finally consider coming back to real flying, and he usually let those calls go to voicemail. It wasn't that he'd stopped loving the sky. It was that the sky had taken something from him he wasn't sure he could survive losing twice. Boarding began soon after, and the 40 passengers moved slowly up the ramp under the watch of medical staff, a mix of soldiers, nurses, and support technicians who had all served on the same overseas relief operation before their transport home was delayed by injury and logistics. Nothing about their condition was dwelt upon in graphic detail. What mattered was the quiet dignity in how they carried themselves, men and women who had already survived one crisis and were simply trying to survive the trip home. Brooks announced over the loudspeaker that a replacement flight crew was cleared and boarding could continue as scheduled. Marlowe Reed, a retired combat medic near the front of the line, spotted Cal being held outside the perimeter fence and immediately raised his hand to stop the loading process, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who had once given orders in far worse conditions than a delayed flight schedule. Brooks bristled, telling him firmly that patients didn't get to select their own pilot. Marlowe answered without raising his voice, saying they weren't asking for a favor. They were exercising the only right they had left, the right not to step onto that aircraft. Word spread down the line of stretchers and wheelchairs within minutes until every single one of the 40 passengers had confirmed at the same position without needing to discuss it twice. Vivian heard the commotion from inside operations and marched down to the ramp herself, furious at what she assumed was a coordinated attempt to embarrass her company in front of local press already gathering near the fence line. Her heel struck the concrete in sharp, deliberate rhythm, the sound of a woman used to walking into rooms and having the noise stop for her. She confronted Cal directly, demanding to know who exactly he thought he was to bring an entire evacuation flight to a standstill over some vague feeling about a sound. Cal answered without raising his eyes from the aircraft's fuselage, telling her simply that he was a man who had heard that particular sound once before, right before a plane went down. The whole ramp went quiet enough to hear the wind moving across the tail section, a silence so complete that even Brooks stopped shuffling his clipboard against his hip. Vivian felt for the briefest instant something crack in her certainty, though she buried it immediately beneath the practiced authority she'd spent years perfecting. She told herself the man was simply gambling on drama to extract a payout or a headline, because that story was easier to hold onto than the alternative. Vivian still refused to believe there was substance behind the disruption, convinced Cal was leveraging the trust of injured veterans for some personal agenda she hadn't yet identified. Brooks fed the moment further, calling Cal a washed-up single father coasting on old war stories nobody could verify. It was the second and sharper insult of the morning delivered in front of the very passengers who had just risked their own comfort to stand behind him. Cal didn't return the anger. He simply asked evenly to see the aircraft's maintenance log from the previous 72 hours. Brooks refused outright, insisting Cal had no authority to request anything on that ramp, and Vivian backed him without hesitation, ordering security to remove Cal a second time. Before anyone could act on the order, Marlowe braced himself against the cabin doorway and called out loud enough for the whole tarmac to hear that the man they called Harbor Ghost didn't need their authority because the passengers standing behind him were authority enough. A government liaison officer coordinating the evacuation overheard the nickname and quietly pulled up Cal's service record on a tablet nearby, his expression changing within seconds. The file confirmed that Calder Rourke had once flown a transport aircraft directly into a coastal storm to complete a rescue operation off the Alaskan coastline, saving 63 people without losing a single one. An act that had earned him a commendation few pilots in his field ever received. The man Vivian had ordered off her ramp twice in one morning was, in the world that actually mattered on days like this, something closer to a legend. With the liaison officer now standing beside him, Cal was granted limited, supervised access to inspect the Atlas before departure. It didn't take him long to find what he'd already suspected from the sound alone, a load stabilization sensor reporting numbers that didn't match physical reality, the kind of discrepancy that could send the aircraft dangerously off balance if it launched into strong crosswinds with a fully loaded medical cabin. Vivian's confidence cracked slightly as she pressed Everett for an explanation of the maintenance paperwork. Everett insisted Cal was exaggerating for attention and Brooks backed him just as firmly, swearing every number on the sheet had passed inspection. Cal pointed to a detail neither man had bothered to check closely, a replacement part number belonging to a batch that had been internally flagged 3 years earlier for a known manufacturing defect. Vivian felt something cold settle in her chest when she realized that exact warning had originated from her own company's records, filed years ago by an engineer named Nora Allison Rourke shortly before her death during an internal investigation into aircraft reporting failures. That file should have remained permanently in Hawthorne's safety archive. Instead, it had disappeared entirely from the current system, as though someone had gone to considerable trouble to erase it. The realization landed with weight neither of them said "Alut" yet. Whatever was wrong with this aircraft wasn't an accident of bad luck or aging parts. Someone inside Hawthorne Aerodyne had reason to want this flight to fail, and reason enough to bury the one warning that might have prevented it years earlier. Cal knelt beside the open access panel a while longer, running his fingers along a seam of rivets that didn't quite match the surrounding metal. The kind of mismatch invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years learning an aircraft skin the way a doctor learns a patient's pulse. He photographed the serial plate, cross-referenced it against a maintenance app on his phone that still carried his old military credentials, and watched the screen return an error indicating the part had been logged as decommissioned 2 years earlier. Someone had pulled a supposedly retired component back into active service and slotted it quietly into the paperwork as new, counting on nobody looking closely enough to notice the discrepancy before the plane was airborne. It was the kind of shortcut that saved a company a modest sum of money and cost nothing at all, right up until the moment it cost everything. Augustus Blackstone called again, his patience audibly thinner, demanding the flight depart immediately before the company lost the government contract altogether. He warned Vivian that delaying departure on the word of a pilot without current commercial certification would be treated by the board as further proof she couldn't manage a crisis under pressure. Vivian found herself caught squarely between protecting the company's public image and protecting 40 lives sitting inside a plane she could no longer fully trust. Everett murmured that Cal could sue the company or manufacture a scandal if allowed to keep interfering, while Brooks announced to anyone listening that one man was effectively holding an entire airfield hostage with his own personal history. Cal absorbed every word without defending himself, then turned toward Marlowe and the rest of the passengers to offer them a way out, telling them plainly they were free to choose a different pilot if they wanted to leave sooner. Marlowe answered for the group without hesitation, saying they had survived this long by trusting the calmest person in any given room, and that hadn't changed today. It was a quiet but unmistakable turning point, the moment when the very people Cal had once pulled from danger were the ones pulling him back toward purpose. Vivian pulled Cal aside into the operations office, away from the noise of the ramp. Her posture still guarded, but her voice noticeably less commanding than before. Cal walked her through the technical failure in plain language, careful not to embarrass her or perform superiority, simply laying out cause and consequence the way an engineer might explain a bridge collapse to someone who needed to understand quickly. He told her that a good executive didn't need to memorize every bolt in a fleet, but she did need to recognize who was telling the truth when everyone else around her was busy protecting their own position. The words landed harder than he probably intended. Vivian sat with the observation longer than she expected to, realizing that nearly everyone in her orbit had spent the last several months telling her exactly what she wanted to hear. Cal, by contrast, wanted nothing from her at all, not a job, not credit, not even an apology yet. She asked why he had come back to a company connected so directly to his wife's death, and Cal answered that the 40 people on that aircraft hadn't done anything to deserve being caught in someone else's cover-up. He added that Nora had always believed Hawthorne's aircraft could save more lives than they cost, provided the company ever stopped hiding its mistakes. Something shifted quietly between them in that small office, not romance, not yet, but the beginning of something closer to mutual respect built slowly out of honesty rather than charm. Vivian studied him for a long moment, noticing details she had dismissed hours earlier without ever really seeing them. The calluses along his knuckles, the steadiness in his hands even now, the way he never once raised his voice to make a point land harder. She had spent her entire career surrounded by men who mistook volume for authority, and here was someone who had access to real authority and never once reached for it. When she finally spoke again, her tone had lost its edge entirely, and she asked him, almost quietly, what it had cost him to walk back onto a tarmac connected to the worst day of his life. Cal considered the question honestly before answering that some debts didn't disappear just because you stopped looking at them. They simply waited for the next person who needed paying back. Vivian walked back onto the ramp and made a decision that stunned nearly everyone watching, ordering a 22-minute hold on departure so Cal could complete a full inspection of the load systems and hydraulics. Augustus Blackstone erupted through the phone line, threatening to have her removed from her position before the day ended. For the first time in months, Vivian didn't flinch or retreat from the confrontation. She announced over the internal channel that Hawthorne Aerodyne would not launch an aircraft while any doubt about its safety remained unresolved, a statement that reversed the entire posture she had walked onto the tarmac with hours earlier. Everett tried to undercut her decision by leaking word to nearby press that the chief executive had lost control of the situation over the objections of a stranger with no formal role at the company. Working quickly inside the aircraft service bay, Cal found physical proof that something had been deliberately tampered with, a broken seal replaced with a mismatched one and a part number that didn't correspond to any authorized inventory batch. He brought the evidence directly to Vivian, and for the first time she understood clearly that someone inside her own organization had engineered this failure rather than simply overlooked it. Brooks, watching the discovery unfold, began to sweat visibly but still refused to admit any personal responsibility. The passengers requested a short meeting with Vivian while repairs continued, and she agreed, walking into the cabin area with far less certainty than she carried that morning. None of them attacked her verbally or dwelt on their injuries. Instead, each one offered a brief account of a moment when Cal had personally saved them or someone close to them during earlier operations. Each story only a sentence or two long, but carrying the unmistakable weight of collective testimony. Marlo summarized it plainly, telling her that she had seen a man without a suit and dismissed him instantly, while they had seen the one person who turned back into the storm when everyone else turned away. One woman near the back of the cabin, a former supply sergeant with her arms still in a sling, added quietly that she remembered Cal flying through weather that had grounded 3 other aircraft that same week, simply because he refused to leave anyone waiting on an airstrip a day longer than necessary. Another passenger, a young corporal who barely looked old enough to have served overseas, said he didn't remember much from the night he was wounded except a voice on the radio telling him to hold on because help was almost there. He'd later learned the voice belonged to the same man standing outside on the tarmac that morning. Each account was short, unadorned, offered without performance. Yet together they built something heavier than any single dramatic moment could have. Vivian felt the shame of the morning settle fully across her chest, but she didn't collapse under it, choosing instead to apologize to Cal directly in front of the assembled group. Cal accepted the apology without using it to humiliate her further, telling her simply that apologies could wait until later, and that right now the priority was getting these people home. In that single exchange, Cal became something more than a wronged bystander in his own story. He became the moral center the entire situation had been quietly orbiting all along. Working with her legal team in a site office, Vivian pulled apart the layers of invoices and vendor codes that Everett had spent months quietly assembling. Each one designed to look ordinary sitting alone, but suspicious the moment they were placed side by side. She discovered that Everett Kane had secretly redirected a portion of the maintenance contract to a shell company connected to Augustus Blackstone's outside investment group, routing payments through 3 separate accounts before the money ever reached its actual destination. The pattern wasn't clumsy. It was patient, built slowly enough that no single transaction would have triggered an alarm on its own. The kind of scheme designed by someone who understood exactly how long an audit typically took to notice anything at all. If today's flight failed publicly, Blackstone would have exactly the justification he needed to force a hostile buyout of Hawthorne Aerodyne at a depressed price, remove Vivian entirely, and sell off the medical transport technology to a competitor eager to inherit the government contracts without the burden of the company's history. It was no longer a story about one flawed part or one careless technician. It was a calculated plan built to profit from tragedy, timed precisely to a flight carrying Plötzlich of the very people the company claimed to exist for. Cal made a connected discovery of his own while reviewing older internal files, confirming that the same category of defect had been flagged years earlier by his late wife, Nora Ellison Rourke, before her death during an internal safety review. Her original report hadn't been lost to bureaucratic accident. It had been deliberately deleted from the company's audit trail by Everett himself, years before today's crisis ever began. The personal weight of Cal's grief and the corporate conspiracy unfolding in real time were, it turned out, the exact same threat. Vivian confronted Everett directly once the evidence was assembled, calling him into a private office rather than airing the accusation in front of staff, a courtesy he did not deserve, but one she extended anyway out of some residual professional habit. He responded with the same arrogance that had carried him through years of quiet manipulation, telling her she would never dare go public because the scandal would damage the Whitlock Hawthorne name beyond repair, and that her father had built the company on exactly this kind of discretion. Vivian let him finish, watching him with an expression he mistook for uncertainty, before answering that she had already recorded their conversation and forwarded the relevant files to the government inspector currently stationed at the airfield. Everett's confidence drained from his face in real time. The practiced calm replaced by something closer to panic as he realized the conversation he thought he controlled had already ended several sentences earlier. He reached for the door, then stopped, then reached for it again as though his body hadn't caught up to what his mind had just understood. The man who believed he had spent years quietly steering the chief executive of Hawthorne Aerodyne suddenly understood that she was no longer a piece he could move and had perhaps never been one at all. Once the faulty component was replaced and the load balance corrected, only a narrow window of survivable weather remained before the storm closed the airspace entirely. The pilot originally assigned to the replacement crew refused to continue under the mounting pressure, and once again, without needing to confer, all 40 passengers asked for Cal by name. There was a complication since Cal hadn't held an active commercial license in several years, but his specialized military clearance remained valid for emergency medical evacuation missions under direct government authorization, a fact the liaison officer on site confirmed within minutes. Vivian signed the emergency authorization in front of the entire ground crew, formally transferring command of the flight to Calder Rourke without hesitation or private negotiation. Brooks Vale found himself in the uncomfortable position of directing under the very man he had insulted and dismissed only hours earlier. Cal didn't use the moment to settle any personal score, assigning tasks clearly and professionally, confirming cargo locks, verifying restraint lines, requesting section-by-section status reports exactly as any disciplined commander would. His composure only made Brooks more aware of how small his earlier behavior had been. As the aircraft began taxiing toward the runway, Vivian stood behind the operations glass watching the man she had twice ordered removed from her property now carrying the full weight of her company's reputation into the storm ahead of them. The storm arrived faster than forecasted once the aircraft reached altitude, bringing turbulence, sharp crosswinds, and intermittent pressure warnings that kept the cockpit tense without tipping into outright catastrophe. Rain hammered the windshield in long diagonal streaks, and the wing lights flickered against a wall of gray cloud that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction the instruments could measure. Cal kept his voice level throughout, guiding the crew through altitude corrections and load redistribution with the same calm that had carried him through worse skies years earlier, calling out headings and adjustments in short, unhurried sentences that gave the rest of the crew somewhere steady to stand. Somewhere behind him in the cabin, Marlowe held the hand of a younger soldier who had gone pale at the sudden drops in altitude, telling him quietly that the man flying this aircraft had done this exact thing before and walked away with everyone he started with. The cabin lights dimmed briefly during a particularly rough stretch of turbulence, and nobody screamed, nobody panicked, because somehow the calm from the cockpit had traveled all the way back through the fuselage to reach them. At one point, Brooks noticed a secondary cargo lock had shifted slightly out of position, and where he might once have hidden the mistake out of fear of blame, he chose instead to report it immediately over the intercom. His voice tight with something closer to honesty than he'd shown all morning. Cal didn't scold him for the error, simply directing the correction through standard procedure in the same even tone he used for everything else. And something in Brooks visibly settled after that exchange. The tension in his shoulders easing for the first time since the plane had left the ground. Later, working the correction alongside a younger crew member, Brooks admitted quietly that he'd spent the whole morning waiting for Cal to remind him of the things he'd said on the ramp, and that the silence had somehow felt worse than any insult thrown back at him would have. It was, in its own small way, the beginning of a different kind of man walking off that aircraft than the one who had boarded it. On the ground, Vivian listened to every transmission crackling through the radio, ignoring 3 separate calls from Augustus Blackstone in favor of staying locked onto Cal's frequency. The tension in the operations room spiked sharply when the aircraft passed through a dense band of cloud cover and lost radio contact for several long seconds. Nobody in the room spoke until Cal's voice returned steady and clear, announcing simply that Harbor Ghost was still right there. The Atlas touched down safely at St. Arden Field, the military medical center awaiting the transfer, and all 40 passengers were moved without incident into the care of waiting medical staff. Marlowe was the first to shake Cal's hand once the ramp lowered, telling him quietly that once again he had brought them home. Word of the flight spread quickly among the press already gathered near the field, and the story they expected to write about a struggling aerospace company suddenly transformed into something else entirely. A narrative about a chief executive who had once ordered a pilot removed from her property and later trusted him with 40 lives instead. Vivian held a brief statement for reporters afterward, standing without notes in front of a small cluster of microphones, refusing to take credit for anything that had happened that day. She told them plainly that Calder Rourke had identified a failure her own internal systems had missed, describing the sequence of events with a directness that surprised even the reporters who had covered her company for years, expecting careful corporate language. She announced the immediate suspension of Everett Kane pending a full independent investigation, along with the restoration of every archived safety report originally filed by engineer Nora Ellison Rourke. Files that would now be made available to federal regulators reviewing the entire fleet. One reporter asked whether she regretted her initial treatment of the pilot on the tarmac, and Vivian answered without hesitation that she regretted it deeply, and that the only honest response to a mistake that size was to say so plainly rather than manage it quietly. It wasn't merely a save of one flight, it forced an entire company to confront a truth it had spent years trying to bury. Augustus Blackstone attempted one final maneuver during an emergency board session, arguing that Vivian's public handling of the crisis had embarrassed the company beyond repair, and that decisive new leadership was needed before the next contract cycle began. He spoke for several minutes uninterrupted, laying out a case built on optics and quarterly projections, confident that numbers alone would carry the room the way they always had before. Vivian arrived prepared, presenting financial records tying Everett directly to Blackstone's outside investment group, timestamps showing contract redirection that predated today's flight by nearly a year, and independent confirmation from the government inspector who had witnessed the entire event unfold from the tarmac itself. She spoke without raising her voice, letting the documents do the work that shouting never could, and watched the room shift its weight the way rooms do when the truth finally outweighs the performance. Board members who had stayed silent through months of pressure now turned their scrutiny fully onto Blackstone, stripping him of any leverage over the pending acquisition attempt he had spent nearly a year quietly assembling. Everett was formally removed from the company within the week and referred for further legal review shortly afterward, his name quietly erased from the same systems he had once used to erase others. Vivian proposed the creation of an independent safety division named the Nora Rourke Flight Integrity Program, intended to prevent exactly the kind of concealment that had cost so much. She personally invited Cal to serve as its lead advisor, not as a symbolic gesture of gratitude, but because he was the rare person willing to say difficult truths when everyone around him preferred comfortable silence. Cal didn't accept immediately, telling her honestly that he had a small family waiting for him and no desire to live permanently inside the shadow of his past. Vivian didn't press him for an answer, leaving only her card and a simple promise that this time Hawthorne would actually listen. Several weeks later, Cal arrived at a smaller regional airfield with Tessa waiting nearby in the car with a family friend, present only briefly in the story, rather than placed anywhere near danger. The morning was clear for once, the kind of pale autumn light that made the runway look almost gentle. Nothing like the great tension of the day. Everything had changed. He noticed a freshly repainted Atlas parked near the hangar, its hull gleaming under a fresh coat, a small inscription near its nose quietly honoring the memory of Nora Ellison Rourke in simple lettering that asked for no attention and received all of it anyway. Cal stood in front of the aircraft for a long moment, the way a man stands in front of a headstone he's finally ready to visit without flinching, letting the quiet settle over him instead of rushing past it the way he had for years. Vivian approached without the usual entourage trailing behind her, dressed more simply than she had been that first morning, carrying the first completed report from the new safety program under one arm. Its pages were filled with corrected failures, restored records, disciplinary actions against the people who had tried to bury them, and confirmation that every one of the 40 passengers had reached their family safely, each name checked off by hand, rather than left to an automated system nobody would ever read closely again. Cal finally agreed to take the advisory role on one condition. He stated plainly, that any pilot or technician in the company would have the standing authority to halt a flight the moment they judged it unsafe, regardless of who sat above them on the organizational chart. He explained that Nora had spent her final year trying to build exactly that kind of protection into the company's internal culture, only to be overruled by people more concerned with schedules than certainty, and that the least he could do now was finish what she'd started under her own name rather than his. Vivian agreed without hesitation, understanding now exactly why that condition mattered more than any title or contract ever could, and she told him she intended to put it in writing that afternoon, signed personally rather than buried in policy language nobody would ever read past the first page. It was, she realized, the first decision she had made in months that had nothing to do with protecting her own position, and it felt lighter than any decision she could remember making before E.T. As Cal walked up the ramp toward the aircraft, nobody moved to stop him this time. Brooks Vale stood at attention near the hatch and addressed him for the first time as Captain Rourke, and Cal answered only with a quiet nod before continuing toward the cockpit. Vivian watched him go, finally understanding something she had missed on the morning she first ordered him off her tarmac, that some people never need a title, a suit, or a powerful family name to command a room. They only need to walk into it, and the whole runway falls silent around them. She thought about her father, about the version of leadership he had taught her, one built on distance and command, and the assumption that authority was a thing you demanded rather than something you earned one honest moment at a time. For the first time in a long while, she found herself grateful that today had finally proven him wrong. Standing there on the tarmac, watching a single father who had lost everything once already choose to give this much of himself again, she understood the difference clearly for the first time in her career. Somewhere out past the hangar, Tessa waved through the car window, and Cal lifted a hand back to her before disappearing through the cockpit door, carrying forward a name that had once been dismissed and would never be dismissed on that runway again.